Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes here and thank you for joining me for this episode of my random album reviews. Today's album is by one of my all-time favourite bands. I've got to say that they're definitely a lock-in for one of my top 5 favourites. And I actually haven't featured any of their albums in a solo video yet, so this will be my first, and I'm super excited that I've finally got a chance to talk about at least one of their albums. So today's band is Neck Deep, and this is their third full-length album from 2017 titled The Peace and the Panic. Now, as usual with my random album reviews, I'll quickly start with a little bit of history between myself and this album, then I'll break down the album as a whole and give my entire thoughts. I'll break down a few of the tracks, and then by the end I'll give it a rating out of 10. So like I said, I'll start off with a little bit of history between myself and this album first, and there actually is a lot that I remember from when this album came out and, listening to it over time, so we'll get into that first. I've spoken about a lot on my channel how I'm very selective with my music, not like how I am with my horror movies. Anything in the horror genre I'll pick up and watch and whatever, but my music I'm a lot more selective. But this album was one of those rare examples, and there's only been a handful of times I've done this in my life, where I've picked up an album without listening to it in its entirety first. I fell in love with Neck Deep with their previous album before this one, being Life's Not Out to Get You, which is an album I fell in love with, and it is still one of my all-time favorites, if not my favorite album of all time, if I'm being completely transparent. So as soon as I heard that a follow-up album was announced, I had the date marked down on my calendar, and I was so keen to grab it and pick it up pretty much no matter what. And I really remember extremely clearly being dropped at the shops by my dad, running around JB Hi-Fi, which was the store I was at to pick this up, and picking it up, coming home and just listening to it straight away from front to back. And I even clearly remember my first reactions to songs that I hadn't heard before and my first thoughts of the album as a whole, so I guess we'll get into that a little bit more in this review. So for deeper context, let's take a flashback to the year 2017. For me personally, it wasn't a great year in my life. However, as I said, when this album was announced, I was just super keen for it. I remember having kind of tunnel vision just waiting for this album to drop. Neck Deep quickly and swiftly pushed themselves into a position of being one of my all-time favourite bands, if not being one of my all-time favourite modern bands. For reasons that I've brought up in videos in the past before, and probably too many specific reasons to go through in today's video, but their album that I briefly brought up before, the previous one to this one, being Life's Not Out to Get You, I came across the year of, or maybe the year after its release, and it was exactly everything that I know and also didn't know I wanted in an album. It just hit the sweet spot. And like I said before, it's got to be one of, if not my favourite album of all time. So patiently waiting for anything new from the band is all I could do in the meantime. And then one day we got the dual leading singles dropped, being Where Do We Go When We Go and Happy Judgment Day. Two songs released at the same time, the two leading singles, and both of them had me completely locked in. Even more so because we also got confirmation that an album was coming. We knew the title of it being The Peace and the Panic. And I also really remember clearly thinking okay, I feel like this could be a concept album, and I had my own theories going about it in my head. And the band has come forward and said that in a way this is a concept album, more so the Peace and the Panic representing the highs and lows of life, hitting some highs as a band and some personal lows, just between albums. But I remember thinking, because with the two leading singles, Where Do We Go When We Go kind of represented peace, and Happy Judgment Day kind of represented the panic. So I was like, is it going to be like a half and half album where maybe 6 songs represent peace, and then another 6 represent panic, and they're a bit more frantic and fast paced, and then the peace ones are a bit more pop leaning and sort of groovy and everything. I was just super hooked. It didn't end up being like that, but I just thought it'd be fun to kind of share what my theories were when I heard the announcement for this album. So going into this review, I always knew that this was a quality album, and it's always been an album that I've enjoyed listening to. But upon revisit for this review, this album held up in so many more ways. It held up with its nostalgia, its joy, and even its importance to me. Maybe it's because I've always put Life's Not Out to Get You on such a high pedestal as being the band's best work done to date, and to be completely transparent, I still believe it is, but it shouldn't take away from how good of an album The Peace and the Panic still is. This album was a slight drift away from the band's straight up pop punk roots, while also not totally deserting what made them a modern staple in the genre either. In a way, you could say that this was the band's first experimental album, which I've always thought was the follow-up album being All Distortions Are Intentional, which not only do I think that this is a better experimental album than All Distortions, but for me to look back 7 years later after the album's release and only just realize how much of an experimental album it actually is, shows how seamlessly that the band actually pulled it off as well. And this album also feels very complete, and what I mean by that is, using a example, their new album from this year, the self-titled record, that album is only one song shorter than the track list on this one, yet this album feels a lot more full and overall rounded out and more complete. And that's not me, sending major criticisms to the new album. I actually really like the new album. But as I said, this one just feels very well-rounded, and it feels like it has a bit of everything, and by the time that the album's over, it doesn't feel like it's cut short or, done you dirty in any way. So getting into the track listing now and making sure that I'll highlight some of the more experimental moments as we go, but it's actually the opening track, Motion Sickness, that probably is the most typical sounding neck deep song that we get off this album, and it's such a cool one to open with as well. It's so full of energy and great lyrics, and it's just such a great time to listen to this song. But then we get into one of the two leading singles for the album being Happy Judgment Day, and for sure, it's still got pop-punk roots at the center of it, but it's also got to be one of three heavier moments off this album, along with tracks Don't Wait, and then the following song being The Grand Illusion, which while we're talking about it, we might as well keep going on with. Kind of a perfect mix of the two previous songs, pop-punk verses and choruses, with a little bit more edge, and then a hard-hitting bridge, which has got to be one of the more infectious bridges off this album also. Mellows right out with a more simple yet catchy track being Parachute, which goes to arguably one of the best anthems on this album being In Bloom, and then right back into some badass heavy surprise with Don't Wait, which features vocals from Architects' Sam Carter, and it gives the song so much more attitude, making it Neck Deep's heaviest song to date. Coming off the back of the heaviest track on the album to one of the more mellow yet still fun sounding tracks being Critical Mistake, which isn't a complete banger, but still is enjoyable enough with its simplicity, and honestly you can kind of just view it as a quick little palate cleanser coming off the back of Don't Wait, which again is the heaviest track on the album. But then we go into the only acoustic track that we have on this effort being Wish You Were Here, which I'm going to quickly skip ahead a few songs and clump in with the second to last track on the album being 1970 something. And the reason why I want to do both of those songs together is because they have a similar theme, talking about the passing of someone close. In the song Wish You Were Here, we have them talking about the passing of a friend, but then in the song 1970 something, it's about a parent. And just to be personal here for a second, guys, and I always like to be honest in my videos and transparent with you guys, but in the year 2017, the year that this album was released and dropped, was also the year that my mum passed away. And it would have been a handful of months before this album dropped that she passed away, but having these songs hit, and having these songs in my life, and especially at a time where obviously I really needed it, and it connected and it was very fresh, definitely did a lot for me. Even hearing those songs live, I believe it would have been in 2018 was when I saw Neck Deep live after this album came out. I've actually seen them a few times now, but standing all night sweating in the mosh pit, hearing those two songs played, still got me emotional. And that's why we listen to our favorite bands and just music in general, connecting to the lyrics and the music. And they're two songs that I really connected with. And as I said, I wanted to be personal. I didn't want to bring the mood down too much or anything. But like I said earlier, this album was impactful to me, and I wanted to be, like I said, honest and open like I always am in my videos, and I wanted to share why this album is so impactful to me, and those songs are definitely a big factor. Now, since I have been going on for a little while, I'm just going to skim through the last few remaining tracks that I haven't brought up yet. First of all, we have Heavy Lies, which in my opinion is super underrated and really hits with some strong lyrics. And then we also have the second of two leading singles, and also the closing track for this album being Where Do We Go When We Go, which is full of energy and again great lyrically. I have heard a few people say that they think Where Do We Go When We Go is too bleak of a song, especially to close the album, but I've never really seen it like that. And just while I'm on the topic of songs, I'm just going to quickly bring up the bonus tracks being Beautiful Madness and Worth It, even though they're not on this edition of the album, so technically I'm not reviewing them, but I wanted to highlight them because they're two really fucking cool songs. So if you can find the very specific edition of this album that have the two bonus tracks, I would recommend picking it up. And it is very annoying that they did put them on a very specific release. Don't ask me what release it was, I do not know. But there is a version of the album that have the bonus tracks Beautiful Madness and Worth It, and I do think it is worth picking up, especially the song Worth It. I fucking love that track. But overall, a really awesome album, and again, one I've always loved, but I do think I let Life's Not Out to Get You outshine this album way too much. And it's not just a strong lineup of songs, but it's impactful and emotional. It's fun and energetic, and with vibes that the band can pull off very well, while also doing a good variety of stuff that is new to them, and it works as well. So to sort of wrap it up and give this album a rating out of 10, originally I was going to give it a 9 out of 10, but as I said, just looking back and being like, wow, this is just a really solid album, and sort of being subtly blind to it because, again, I think I was letting other Neck Deep albums sort of outshine it in a way. But I maybe a little bit of a generous and biased edge. I'm going to give Neck Deep's album, The Peace and the Panic, a 9.5 out of 10. So there we go, guys. Thank you for joining me for another one of my random album reviews. As usual, I will be doing a track list ranking of this album also, so if you want to know my thoughts of the entire track list in a little bit more detail and hear me rank them from my least favourite song to favourite song, which was very hard because this was a 9.5 out of 10 album for me. Very tricky, but go check out that video because it should be up at the same time. But again, thank you for joining me for this video, guys, and I'll see you for another one, I'm sure, soon enough. Thanks.